Hi, Tendai.
Hi, Clive. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
Good,
Are we
good.
starting soon?
Yes, we're starting. I think we can go ahead.
Okay.
We were just waiting for Mr. Kosi to come on, but he'll come on in due course.
Okay.
Yeah, so he'll come on in due course. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the informative session on science and harm reduction, which is the Ask Me session. Thank you for giving us your time to be with us this morning. The session is being recorded, just for your information. The structure of the session will be, we will have two keynote speakers, followed by a question and answer session after each one. So please get your questions ready. If you like, you can also post questions whilst they're talking in the chat box, and I'll go through those, but we will have a session for you to ask your questions after each session, and then we can have a general discussion. Please, this is an interactive session. We're very happy to answer any questions along the way. Just by way of background, before I introduce our first speaker today, the smoking prevalence is relatively low on the African continent, despite projections by the World Health Organization that the number of total users in Africa will increase to 62 million, of whom 51 million will be smoking combustible tobacco by the year 2025. This increase will largely be driven by the huge explosion of population growth that we have here on the continent, as well as stress levels. Whilst the rest of the world is expected to have smoking prevalence decrease, Africa will increase. However, overall smoking rates in Africa remain low by international comparisons, with a prevalence of 8.4% across the continent. So just by way of background, today we're talking about science and harm reduction, and our first speaker will speak to us about tobacco harm reduction and smoke-free products, and how tobacco harm reduction is being spearheaded by smoke-free products. The first speaker today is Mr. Clive Bates. Welcome, Clive.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here.
Yes, good. And Clive has had a very diverse career in the public and private and non-for-profit sectors. He started out with the IT company IBM, and then switched career to work in the environment movement. From 1997 to 2003, he was the director of Action on Smoking and Health UK, campaigning to reduce the harms caused by tobacco. And in 2003, actually, he joined Prime Minister Blair's the strategy unit as a civil servant, and worked in senior roles in the public sector for the United Nations in Sudan as well. Right now, Clive is currently the director of Counterfactual, a consulting and advocacy practice focused on a pragmatic approach to sustainable public health. So I will hand over the floor to you, Clive. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tendai, and welcome. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I should just add that I have no conflicts of interest. I'm not in the pay of big tobacco or the vaping companies or anything. So I'm coming at this from a public health point of view. On the themes that Tendai and the organisers have asked me to present on, I have put some slides together to sort of illustrate some themes. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we have about 15 minutes of Q&A, and then we go on to panel 2, which is Kosi after me. So let me share my screen. Hopefully everything will work perfectly. There we go. So yes, I'm just going to talk about tobacco harm reduction and the smoke-free products. Just give some background to what this is all about, okay? Let me just get started. Hang on. Right, smoking, nicotine, and harm. Call this first section. I mean, I'm just rehearsing here just what a monumental burden smoking is on public health. Kills around 8 million people annually, more than all of these other things put together. worldwide this is, and roughly similar to COVID-19 on an annual basis. If you take the COVID death toll in 2020 and 2021, that's roughly equivalent to the annual death toll associated with smoking. And actually in many of much the same sort of demographics, sort of older people. It's the currency of tobacco control. It's why we're interested. So all of that disease, that cancer, that cardiovascular disease, the strokes, the COPD, and then the burden that places on the healthcare system, the burden it places on family life, the loss of opportunity, the fact that people don't grow up with seeing their grandkids and so on. That's why we're bothered. That's why there is a tobacco control movement focused on the harm. And I know I'm stating the obvious, but we're going to come back to that because I think it's really important. Okay, just to reinforce some of the points that Tendai was making, there's actually a very varied rate of smoking on the African continent. Top of this, you know, the league that you don't want to be top of is South Africa. And then big countries like Ethiopia and Nigeria, much lower rates, okay? But because those countries have large populations, if you look at the number of people, the number of smokers, then Nigeria and Ethiopia creep up the league. So the top 5 in terms of people, rather than percentages, is South Africa, Algeria, DR Congo, Madagascar, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia. It's the top 6. Okay. Again, reinforcing Tendai's point, it's true that smoking rates are going down, but because population is growing and it's growing faster in Africa, the Afro region of WHO is going to take on a steadily larger percentage of the total number of the world's smokers, which itself may actually increase with population growth. So we still have this problem. It's getting worse in Africa. So as healthcare improves, as communicable diseases decline, as life expectancy increases, then non-communicable diseases, like those caused by smoking, start to play a bigger role in the overall impact on health in a country. If you're not dying earlier from, you know, malaria or TB or something, then these diseases start to hit you later in life. So the fundamental insight, we keep coming back to the centrality of harm, is that people smoke for the nicotine, but they die for the tar. Okay. Now this means that when people are smoking, what they really want is the nicotine and the experience of nicotine. Okay, it comes with other things like throat sensation, flavors, hand-to-mouth movement. It's a social thing. There's rituals and so on. But at the heart of it, smoking is a nicotine-seeking behavior, and the demand for nicotine is very strong. As we'll see later, people want nicotine whether we like it or not. And this is where technology comes in, because we now have a range of products that can give people the nicotine, but without the tar, without the combustion, without the smoke. So smoking is the inhalation of the products of combustion. These products either don't use any heat at all, or they use electricity to heat an aerosol and create a kind of clean smoke, if you like, although it's not smoke because it's not combustion. And broadly 4 types of categories: vaping products, in which a battery heats the liquid into an aerosol; heated tobacco products, it's the same kind of thing, except the aerosol is created from liquid that's been immersed in tobacco; unheated nicotine products, so these are like pouches and things that you put under your gum or in your mouth; and then more traditional smokeless tobacco and snus. Okay, now all of these are capable of delivering nicotine, but without significant exposure to harm and to toxins. And the evidence we rely on this, I mean, we obviously don't have time travel. We can't go forward 50 years and find out what actually happened. But what we can do is we can understand the risks of these products by looking at the exposure to toxicants in the body. And there are many studies like this, and this is just one I've drawn out an example on. But what we find is that when people switch to these products, they are exposed to much lower levels of all the toxicants that we know are harmful and associated with smoking. Okay, either the toxicants are at levels too low to detect, or they're at levels that are very much lower. I mean, there's some exceptions to that, but generally very much lower levels of toxic burden. And in some cases, right down to the same as non-smokers or people who quit completely. So that's where we base our evidence. And this is what has caused major health organizations to come out with statements like this. We may not be possible to quantify the long-term risks, but these are unlikely, this is for vaping, unlikely to exceed 5% of those associated with smoked tobacco products, and may well be substantially lower. A massive study done in the United States in 2018, likely to be far less harmful than combustible tobacco cigarettes. And then the most recent huge survey, 1,400 pages plus a backup report, done by the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities in the UK, led by Anne McNeil. Vaping poses only a small fraction of the risks of smoking. So what we have here is the prospect of an alternative to smoking at very, very much lower risk. And that has to be seen as a huge public health opportunity for people who don't want to quit or can't quit or like nicotine or get something from it. Switching is going to be far easier thing to do than asking them to quit completely. To go from smoking to complete abstinence is going to be more difficult than going from smoking to, say, vaping. So the demand for nicotine is much more robust and resilient than the demand for any particular way of taking it. And what this heralds is the end of smoking. And I'm very optimistic about this, that 8 million person a year death toll, we are beginning to see how that will end now. And there was a great piece done by academics in the United States in which they said that these alternative nicotine delivery systems, that's the 4 type that I mentioned, will disrupt the 120-year dominance of the cigarette and will ultimately lead to the obsolescence of smoking. We will no longer have that dominance in the future. And we're starting to see good evidence here. The gold standard of evidence is randomized controlled trials. And this is from the Cochrane Review, which synthesizes and summarizes all the randomized controlled trials. It's high certainty evidence that e-cigarettes with nicotine increase quit rates compared to nicotine replacement therapies. And we also see supportive evidence, yes, from randomized controlled trials, from comparative observational studies, when we look at what happens when people use these products over time. And then we see population trends. When e-cigarette use takes off, we see cigarette smoking falling more rapidly. We also have huge amounts of user testimony that this has worked for them. And although people say that's just anecdotes, you have to take it seriously if you're taking the science seriously. And frankly, it's what you'd expect. If people can get something they want, like nicotine, from a product that does them far less harm, is much cleaner, has much less stigma associated with it, is much cheaper, why wouldn't they switch? You know, so what we have is a market dynamic that is moving to people towards using these products instead of smoking. And that's a very beneficial thing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It's very, very beneficial when somebody switches from smoking to vaping. That's a good thing. Now, they don't always switch completely. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes they have a period of using both. Sometimes people who never intended to quit smoking in the first place try these products and eventually quit smoking. And we call those accidental quitters. So these are often getting to the people that are hardest to quit and most at risk from smoking related diseases. Briefly on policy considerations, because this is the main focus of the next panel. essentially, we are trying to engineer a policy framework in which people abandon cigarettes on the one hand and adopt vaping on the other, and then non-users don't take it up if necessary. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go into this, and as I say, it's the focus of the next session. But again, the Royal College of Physicians wrote the most sensible thing on this. I'm going to show a dense block of text now, don't worry, we're going to unpack that. But they were talking about regulation and harm reduction, and they raised the crucial question of unintended consequences. So let me unpack that text that's there highlighted in the yellow. So if a risk-averse and precautionary approach makes e-cigarettes less easily accessible, less palatable or acceptable, more expensive, less consumer-friendly, pharmacologically less effective, in other words, they deliver nicotine less than they do with cigarettes, or it inhibits innovation, then it causes harm by perpetuating smoking. And that is the one slide, the one thing I wish every policymaker could see, every policymaker understood. There isn't a free ride here. If you think you're being tough on vaping, it may turn out that you're actually being soft on smoking and you're driving people back to smoking or putting barriers in the way of quitting. And that's a really bad thing for public health. So well-intentioned people are perfectly capable of doing a great deal of harm if they don't understand the problem of unintended consequences. A couple of examples. One big international group calls for outright bans. It's a ridiculous policy. You ban all the safer products and you leave the most dangerous on the market intact. What's going to happen? People are going to smoke the more dangerous products, and there's going to be illicit trade formed to supply people with the safer products that they want. Couldn't be a worse policy. No discussion of unintended consequences has gone into forming that policy. Here's another one, banning flavored e-liquids. Here's evidence from San Francisco. San Francisco is the orange line, and this is smoking amongst young people. Other districts that are similar is the black line. And what you can see is that teenage smoking increased following an e-cigarette flavors ban. So it's an example of unintended consequences. Now, I'm not going to go through that exhaustively, but there are just two examples there of where you should really expect unintended consequences.
How are you?
Okay, sorry, I missed that.
No, I don't.
Okay, I'll carry on. All right, why do people use nicotine? I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but we have to understand that people use nicotine. Hello, hi.
Kosi, please can you mute? Thank you. Go ahead, Clive.
Thanks, okay. Okay, I just wanted to understand, we've got to understand that why the demand for nicotine is so robust and why people will use it and like it, okay? Here is Neil Benevitz, one of the world's authorities. It provides stimulation, pleasure, reduces stress and anxiety, and is useful for mood control. Here is Paul Newhouse, again, one of the most famous researchers in the world on nicotine. It brings, for some people, not everybody, it can bring cognitive improvement. It helps with attentionally and cognitively demanding tasks. It can optimize attention response and enhance working memory. So we have to be clear here that we're dealing with a drug that has hedonistic, therapeutic, and functional benefits to people, and that's basically why they use it. There's a demand for it for a reason, and we have to think of it alongside other drugs like caffeine, like moderate alcohol consumption, and increasingly like cannabinoids, and ask the question, well, if there's a demand for it, how do we provide it in the safest possible way? Because we are not anytime soon heading for a nicotine-free society. And again, here is Michael Russell, the sort of, if you like, the spiritual guidance of this presentation. There's no compelling objection to the recreational or even addictive use of nicotine, providing it is not shown to be physically, psychologically, or socially harmful to the users or to others. Now, it is harmful if it's smoked. It's barely harmful or not very harmful if it's not smoked, if it's taken in a smoke-free format. So that whole societal attitude to nicotine has to change when it doesn't come along with the harms and perils of smoking. Okay, I'm going to wind up now. So I think we need to think of these new technologies as a technology transition. And much as the car is moving from the internal combustion engine to the electric motor, we have to see it as a phased transition like that, a change almost of energy technology from combustion to electrical heating inside the nicotine delivery system. And we also see, it's not surprising, but we also see large companies who are in this market, the tobacco companies, want to get into this, okay? And that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing if big tobacco wants to move into these products. It's better that they get out of the merchant of death business and start providing nicotine to people who want it in a way that isn't going to kill them, okay? And that's, again, another aspect of this transition. I am going to leave it there, and we're now open for questions.
Much, Clive. That was great. I think I took that statement very clearly, that people smoke for nicotine, but they die from the actual smoke. And that's quite a powerful statement. We are open for questions. Please go ahead and ask any questions that you might have. Would you like, anybody who has a question, would you like to raise your hand, and then we can take those questions. But I think I'll kick off with a couple of questions that I have, Clive. And one of those is, I know you're not a doctor, but you've been around this area for quite some time. I mean, people often think, okay, so this nicotine, is it actually something that we should perceive to be as less or as harmful as things like caffeine, alcohol, you know, and CBD, for example?
It's a great question, Tendai, and actually if the harms of nicotine stripped away from the smoke, okay, which is actually quite difficult to do. I mean, no one would argue that it's entirely benign, and it's probably somewhere on a scale between, you know, caffeine and moderate alcohol consumption, you know, roughly speaking. Obviously, alcohol comes with all kinds of problems that you don't have with nicotine. You don't have violence, you don't have people having road accidents, you don't have vulnerability, people making themselves open to abuse, you don't have liver disease and all of that. But in terms of the actual stimulant, I think it's probably comparable to like light, moderate sort of social drinking. Yeah. There is some evidence that nicotine can aggravate pre-existing cardiovascular problems, and there's some evidence that if you already have cancer, it can promote the spread of a tumor, essentially by changing the way that the blood is supplied to the tumor. But there isn't really a very solid body of evidence against nicotine. And even with things like vaping or heated tobacco products, any harms that are done are more likely to be done by the aerosol and products of thermal decomposition or impurities in the aerosol than they are by the nicotine itself, which is probably why the products that you put in your mouth are really you know, very safe indeed.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much, Clive. We have a couple of.
Got you a snack.
Okay, I don't want it, Dolly. I'm in the middle of a.
Okay.
Okay, go, sweetheart, go away, please. Thanks.
I'll take the snack.
No, I don't want the snack now. Come on, off you go. Go. I'm sorry about that, folks. That's my daughter.
I know, but I'll have the snack if you don't want to.
Okay.
All right. Clive, we have a couple
yeah,
we have
good.
A couple of questions that have come through. The first question is from Kudakwashe Pembere from Health Times Zimbabwe. And he Oh, actually, Kuda, that's your question is not actually there. Do you have a question, Kuda? Okay. Maybe we will ask, we'll see what his question was. So the second question is from Anne Meaty. And she says that Anna Meaty, and she says that a big barrier to using alternatives to smoking, such as nicotine patches, is accessibility. For example, with cost or even information for us in Africa, you know, there's a huge barrier there. How will this be factored into the quest for harm reduction?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And it's true that some of these devices are extremely expensive, okay? And, you know, be unaffordable for many people. However, the devices are getting cheaper all the time. And the important thing is they're getting to the point where they're cheaper than smoking. Even in the situation where there is relatively low tax. And remember, the policy that most countries have is to raise taxes on cigarettes. So low-cost vaping products are now on the market. And in fact, they're flooding the market in Europe. And the cost of actually being a user has come way down with innovation and volume. And then there are these new products, the pouches, which are as kind of like smokeless tobacco equivalent, which are very cheap indeed, and they're very easy to make, and they are very, very affordable at all levels. And I think one of the things we've also got to bear in mind is that, you know, obviously there's, you know, I've just spent the last 4 years in Nigeria, and there are, you know, millions of people who are very poor indeed. Many of them would be too poor to smoke and wouldn't smoke, you know, it wouldn't be their priority. So there is also people who are, you know, an emerging middle class, an emerging sort of growing incomes in Africa, you know, as part of the demographics and progress. So we have to also bear in mind that these products are trying to intercept African nations as they grow in prosperity. And one of the dangers is that people get richer and cigarettes become more affordable. We'll get more of that uptake amongst adults and young people, and that will power the growth of the smoking market. So here we have a product that would head that off and, you know, hopefully stop growing prosperity in Africa, leading to an increase in smoking. And then, you know, I just think in the end, people will prioritize this if it's good for their health and they feel as though they're stuck on smoking.
Right. Okay. I think that's very clear. Josephine Chinele, it's along the same lines, talks about the fact that Malawi has ratified the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the FCTC. And how is this going to advance harm reduction technologies in Malawi, considering that THR technologies are relatively low in Malawi? We saw that, well, I guess South Africa has the highest smoking prevalence, but it's also where the products are most available, the technologies are most available on the African continent. But
yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting question. I mean, first of all, the FCTC is what the delegates make it. So the delegates from Malawi have to stand up for Malawi's national interest. And I've just written an article about how delegates to the COP, which is coming up in November, should approach it. And they should approach it with their national interests in mind, their public health priorities in mind, and they should make sure the convention does what they want. Everything in the convention is agreed by consensus. And if Malawi disagrees with something, or any of the African countries disagree with something, they can basically stop it. I mean, they tend not to. The nature of international negotiations is that they form a bloc. The African countries will form a bloc and will tend to vote together to try and have more influence. But it's really important that delegates to the FCTC don't just go with the flow. It's very hostile to harm reduction. It's very influenced by American-funded non-governmental organizations who are very, very noisy and very busy in the negotiations. WHO itself is funded by, Michael Bloomberg, a prohibitionist billionaire foundation founder, and it does basically what they want him to do. He is pushing a prohibition agenda for these products. That's a report that I showed you from the Union calling for prohibition is essentially funded by him. And he's also funding WHO, and he's also, until recently, funded the World Bank. So the American overseas foreign influencing operations are very, very prominent in the FCTC, and delegates need to be aware of that. And it will also be true in Malawi, I have no doubt. In terms of specific advice to Malawi, I would just say, use your vote. You use your vote to get what you want. If you want more harm reduction reflected in the text or in the decisions, then that's where you have leverage. And that's the advantage of joining the convention rather than staying outside it. You actually move from having no influence to having some influence. The question is, how do you use the influence? And I will just circulate my article on this that I did. I'll put that in the notes if that's okay. It'll give you an idea of what I'm on about.
Okay, I think that's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. So Clive has shared the link to that article.
I've not shared it. So I need to share it to everyone. Sorry.
To hosts and panelists, yes, share to everyone. Thanks for that, because the question is always asked to say, well, if harm reduction is so helpful, why is it that we have governments who will not legislate? But we'll take that onto Kosi's session next, who will not legislate to make the harm reduced smoke-free products more accessible to people. Okay, so we have another question here, which is that there are some. Oh, by the way, there's also a request for you to share your presentation if you're willing to. You could send that through, and Vimbai can or the organizers can send it through to.
I'll do that. I'll send it to you if that's okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So there's a question that from Kudakwashe Pembere now, that he's saying that some schools of thought argue that vaping is harmful to one's oral health as smoking cigarettes. So this is not really talking about the lungs and the different cardiovascular things, but he's talking specifically about the oral health. And then along with that, I can add Titi's question from the Q&A box, where she says, how dangerous is passive smoking, even if it's vaping smoke? Is the vaping smoke as dangerous as,
All right. The first thing on the oral health argument. I mean, I review typically 40 to 50 studies a week on that cover all aspects of this field, and quite often you'll see a study that pops up and says that vaping, vaping causes backache, or vaping causes oral health problems, or vaping is just as bad for oral health. The issue with these things is you have to look in detail at what the study actually says, whether did they correct for prior smoking. Almost everybody who vapes above a certain age has been a smoker for many years. Okay, so did they correct for that? Did they correct for alcohol consumption? What you find is that things like vaping and smoking behaviors and alcohol consumption and poor diet are all similar. Similar people have those similar characteristics, and these are called confounding effects. Not all researchers correct for them properly. Or did they just pick on one marker of oral health and make a very generalized conclusion about it? Now, as far as I know, this literature shows that vaping has some effects on oral health, but they're nothing like as bad as smoking. So even for oral health, there is a big harm reduction benefit, but it's not the equivalent of giving up completely or never starting. But sometimes you will find studies that present it as if they're equivalent. If there's a specific study, I'd be happy to look at it and see whether the conclusions are justified. But you've got to remember, a lot of the scientists in this field are trying to make a point. They don't like this. They don't like this approach. They think people should just quit smoking completely, give up nicotine completely. And therefore, they're trying to find reasons why vaping is harmful. The other thing I think it's worth bearing in mind is, if vaping is basically as dangerous as caffeine or similar, which is not very dangerous at all, then what's the point of all these public health jobs? What happens to all the people who are involved in universities, in academia, in anti-smoking organizations, public health departments? There's nothing for them to do. We don't have such a thing as coffee control. We only have tobacco control, because tobacco is extremely harmful when smoked. But if it's not harmful when vaped, or not very harmful when vaped, then all of that is unnecessary. So one has to slightly see the scientists and anti-smoking people as an interest group in this. I hope I don't sound like a mad conspiracy theorist, but they are an economic interest group. They are, and their livelihoods and their grants and their university departments are threatened by nicotine that doesn't cause much in the way of harm. And therefore you have to see them as conflicted. Doesn't mean that what they're saying is wrong. It just means you have to apply quite a lot of skepticism to everything you hear from them. Well, everything you hear from everyone, frankly.
Yeah.
But don't give them an easy ride just because they're from a public health department or a university.
Okay, so I'm just, in the interest of time, I'm going to take one more question here. We have some very interesting questions from Kondwani, Monica, and from Daniel, Daniel Chigundu. And these questions are really moving into the area that Kosi will speak about. So we will hold those questions until we get to that session, and then we'll still have an open question and answer session. Clive will still be on the call. Just the last ones we'll take on the vaping side. Juliet spoke about indications. I think you've touched on this in terms of the safety of vaping. Talked about there've been these indications that vaping induces transient lung inflammation, the gas exchange, and things like that. She just wanted to know, just to quickly clarify that.
Let me just say something about that. I mean, first of all, it's difficult to react to a statement like that without seeing the study. And there are studies that show inflammatory effects, but you have to be careful with what they actually mean by that, and where these effects are observed. I mean, remember, the body has all kinds of anti-inflammatory defenses, resilience. It is able to regenerate cells and so on. So there's quite a lot of things that cause inflammation. The question is whether that leads to a substantive public health risk, that will manifest itself as, cancer, cardiovascular disease, COPD, or something like that. Okay. And also, whenever there is a discussion of a harmful effect, I always have the slogan, magnitude matters. Is that a lot or a little? And how does it compare to smoking? I mean, those are the questions to ask about that study. Gas exchange disturbances, I'm not familiar with that one. But again, it's a matter of looking, it's a matter with all of these studies, and particularly as a journalist, because you get these things fired at you. You ask the question, what are they actually describing here, and how does that lead to a material harm? Secondly, how does this compare to smoking? Have they got a comparison with smoking here? Or, is it a lot or a little? Is it a minor change from the norm? Has it been
Right.
done in animals? Has it been done in vitro in cell studies? In which case you should be very skeptical unless there's plenty of other comparative data. And what does the epidemiology tell you? If it's something to do with nicotine, what do we know from nicotine exposure from smokeless tobacco and from NRT? So it's a matter of adopting a journalist's critical approach to these studies each time and looking hard at what they're actually telling us and whether they're making sweeping generalizations from what are actually quite minor observations.
Thanks for that, Clive. I think that you know, what you're saying is very important in terms of the fact that there is no one answer on the safety of vaping, for example, or on any of those things. It's really about looking at each one. I mean, I was thinking, as we move on to Kosi, I was thinking about the issue of standards. You had said earlier on that there's a plethora of different vaping products or smokeless products that are available out there. And of course, there are different ones produced by different people. And there's the issue of standards, regulation, and the science behind them, which is exactly what Kosi is going to speak about. So we will come back to Kondwani, Monica, and Daniel, and then we will also have the conversation around young people that Fatima has.
Fatima has raised that question.
Yeah, we'll have that.
Come back to that at the end.
Yeah, let's come back to that afterwards when we've looked at regulation, so we can have a final holistic discussion. So with that, thank you so much, Clive.
And also the passive vaping question, which I didn't get to. So
yes, we'll also come back to the passive vaping versus passive smoke inhalation. Yeah, so with that, thanks, Clive. Please stay on the line. We'll be back to you soon. I would like to introduce Dr. Kosi Letlape, who is going to talk to us for about 15 minutes on policies, regulation, and the science behind tobacco harm reduction. So he'll talk to us on science-led harm reduction policies and practices and the regulatory landscape. So Kosi Letlape is an ophthalmologist actually from South Africa and is a former president of the Health Professions Council and chairman of the Medical and Dental Board of South Africa. He is the current president of the Africa Medical Association and the president of the Association of Medical Councils of Africa. He is also the past chairman of the board of the South African Medical Association, SAMA, and past president of the World Medical Association, the global representative body for physicians. He was admitted as a fellow of the College of Surgeons of South Africa in April 1988 and as a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh Ophthalmology in 1988 as well. He is the former executive director of the Japan Trust, which is a non-for-profit organization that pioneered the provision of treatment for HIV and AIDS, where he really started advocating for harm reduction in that area. He is a healthcare activist who believes that everyone in South Africa has a right and deserves to receive equal health care, and that a lot of today's illnesses can be prevented. And to that end, he co-founded the African Harm Reduction Alliance, whose aim is to create awareness and educate about the need to reduce harm and promote well-being. He's also an avid golfer, lives in Johannesburg at the moment. So I believe you're not in Johannesburg at the moment, Kosi, in Rwanda, but I give you the floor.
Thank you, Tendai, and thanks for inviting me. I guess it's very difficult to have anything left to say after Clive has spoken. And maybe I should just summarize by saying there are effectively no relevant or modern policies throughout Africa on tobacco. So what we would be talking about is what is intended rather than what is. And I'll use South Africa as an example. We are dealing with a proposed new tobacco bill, which makes for horrifying reading. It's like reading a manifesto of a religious organization. And it's moving towards prohibition. Now, let me go back to the basics and say, as Clive emphasized, the problem with tobacco-related diseases, they are largely come from products of combustion. So the way you can reduce the harm associated with tobacco use is to look at the less harmful, non-combustible products that are available. Because the key problem is combustion. Now, when you look at the FCTC was basically adopted in 2003. At the time that the FCTC was adopted, there was really only one alternative to combustion as a class of product. And you had tobacco either by combusting it or by chewing it or by grinding it, putting it into your mouth or nostrils as snuff. Those would be called smokeless tobacco. And there were associated harms in relation to smokeless tobacco, most of which were in the oral cavity in terms of oral cancers, etc. Now, just before 73, a scientist in Sweden decided to put the loose tobacco into a sachet, and that's how snus was born. So snus is a product that's been available predating the FCTC. It was introduced to the market in 1973 in Sweden and really had an uptick in 1977. So snus has been used for over 40 years in Sweden. Now, the interesting thing is that when snus came up and the FCTC was signed, the recommendation from the WHO was for snus to be banned. The Swedes got an exemption because that was a cultural product that they had modernized over 200 years of use. So they got an exemption. So from the period of 2003, they had then been using snus for nearly 20 odd years, 26 years. And they got an exemption. They continued to make snus available in their environment. When the ratification occurred, there were really no other alternatives. There were no electronic cigarettes. There were no heat-not-burn products on the market. A pharmacist in Hong Kong developed the modern e-cigarette. So basically, e-cigarettes come into the fore around 10 years, really, after the FCTC, 2013. That's when they are really, HonLink has made them appropriate for today, modernized them so that they are commercially viable. And you see e-cigarettes come in. Come around 2013, 2015 or so, heat-not-burn comes onto the market. Come to 2017, nicotine pouches come onto the market. So when you look at the FCTC, when it was written and adopted, there was only one non-combustible product that had changed from traditional use, which was snus, which was banned by the WHO. And we now see the results of what has happened to the disease profile in Sweden, largely because of the use of snus. Now, in Sweden, just in short, most males get their nicotine through snus. Most females still get their nicotine through cigarettes. They've now had an uptake amongst females of other alternatives, e-cigarettes and heat-not-burn products. But the FCTC is inappropriate to be used as a framework to look at alternatives to combustible cigarettes. Now, interestingly, in the FCTC, you have Article 1D, which spoke about harm reduction in relation to the challenges presented by tobacco products. But when we had that phrase, besides snus, which they banned, there were really no reduced risk products on markets. So if you fast track to now, you cannot apply the Framework Convention tobacco matrix as it is to the risk-reduced products. So what any well-meaning nation needs to do is to look at a framework of regulating the RRPs appropriately. Regulation is necessary, but regulation must be based on evidence and it must be based on science. And the evidence is quite clear. Combustion is the problem. Now, as Clive alluded, you see people that have now switched from fighting combustible tobacco to fighting nicotine in any form, which is a different game plan. Now, what is perplexing is the fact that you see in many jurisdictions, people coming around where you decriminalizing marijuana, where we now understand that the component that people are seeking in that hair is cannabinoids. So the CBD framework is different from the marijuana framework. In its original form, it is still illegal in most countries. Its use is not promoted. But when the cannabinoids are extracted, that is being promoted. And funnily enough, in my country, they are allowed to put CBD in anything. They put CBD in food. They put CBD in cakes. They put CBD in sweets. And they sell it anywhere. And our government is okay with that. So just remember that for Dagga, CBD is the equivalent of nicotine for tobacco. But you now see efforts to now ban nicotine in all its forms. But here's the thing that you may find ironic. In our proposed bill, there's an exemption for nicotine if it's by prescription. There's an exemption for nicotine replacement therapy, which incidentally was also developed really post the FCTC. People like Carl Fagerstrom went into researching nicotine, and when people like Michael Russell said in '76, people die from the tar, but what they seek is the nicotine. That statement inspired people like Carl Fagerstrom to research nicotine and come up with nicotine alternatives. That's how nicotine replacement therapy was born. It's in pharma. You can get it in gums. Now, ask yourself a question. If the nicotine comes from a patch or it comes from a gum, is it different from the nicotine that comes from an e-cigarette or that would come from a nicotine pouch? The answer is no. So why the difference? So we need to ensure that we advocate for policies that are based on science, not belief. And we also have to understand that any policy framework that is worth its piece of salt, that is not harmful to society, has to embrace the principles of harm reduction and apply them fully to tobacco use, as was the promise of Article 1D of the FCTC. Now, one of the things that also needs to be taken out in terms of how we deal with FCTC is 5.3 about engagement of the industry. We know that there can be no solution without engaging the people that cause the problem. If we talk about a thing that is a hazard to all of us, climate change, the environment, the key is to have the polluters in the room and ask them to reduce emissions. You can't do it without them. So we need to get the industry inside, encourage them to switch from combustibles which are harmful to health to alternatives which are less harmful. And we need to ensure, as has been discussed previously, that we create a legislative framework that will improve access to people who smoke, that will improve people being well informed about the effects of these products. I mean, as a physician, I always say, if you're not using nicotine, if you're not using cigarettes, don't start. If you're using cigarettes, quit. If you can't quit, use alternatives. But our bill just talks about quitting. So without writing the dire component into our bill is a quit or die bill, which reminds us of HIV days when people were denied ARVs in our country and they were left to die, and we had to fight to ensure. And the argument that was used in that context was that ARVs are toxic, etc., etc. People didn't do a cost-benefit analysis. There is nothing that has no side effects. Anything can be a poison. It depends on dose. Even water. If you take too much water, you get water intoxication, you get your brain swelling, and you can die from that. Even from politics, even democracy. Democracy in overdose can be destructive to a society. Even the democracy have harms around it, but democracy is the best form of government. So as we promote democracies, we also need to apply harm reduction strategies. And the biggest harm that is associated with democracies is corruption and removal of civil liberties. But we're not going to do away with democracies. We will promote the aspects that would reduce harm associated with democracies. Limited terms for leaders, an educated society, an informed voter. You can't get rid of corporate influence on democracies, but you must reduce its corruption effect on democracies. So harm reduction is a part of what we do. And any bill that seeks to reduce the harms associated with recreation has to embrace harm reduction that is science-based to come up with sound policies that will reduce harm in societies. But what we see now, the FCTC, which is appropriate for reducing harm associated with combustible cigarettes, which should be supported, it's wholly inappropriate for other alternatives to combustions that are becoming readily available and other technologies that we do not know about. So we need to create an appropriate framework where we regulate products in accordance with the harm associated with those products. And that is what should inform our policymaking and our regulations. And we want our government not to take sides, to be open to people from all sides, to present evidence in front of them. And they must make policies based on science. We must make policies based on what we know, not what we don't know. And we got to stop promoting fear through lies and ignorance. You know, the EVALI debacle, the formaldehyde debacle, the fact that most people think non-combustible alternatives are as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than cigarettes, which is devoid of truth. And the science does not back that. And journalists have to begin to ask probing questions. Even to us who are pro-harm reduction, we need to be asked questions. And lastly, I just refer you to jurisdictions that have embraced harm reduction, but that are looking for evidence. The US, the FDA has given different approvals to different reduced risk products. They've allowed snus to make a health benefit claim because that is based on fact. When you look at Sweden and the reduction of tobacco-related diseases because of snus, that is the evidence that they've looked at. They've allowed certain vaping products to make a public health benefit claim based on evidence. They've allowed IQOS, a heat-not-burn product, to make a claim of reduced exposure based on evidence, toxicological analysis that shows that the most harmful chemicals that we have known to cause cancer and COPD are either eliminated or greatly reduced based on evidence and science. And lastly, as a healthcare professionals that lie on their studies, that misrepresent facts, should be dealt with by the relevant regulatory bodies so that the ethics of the professions should still be maintained. All of us should be held accountable for what we put out there. Thank you, Tena.
Thank you so much, Kosi. I think, wow, I think to the delegates, we have the most powerful two harm reduction advocates on the planet here. I can see your questions coming through. Thank you so much, Kosi. I think I got very clearly that there is actually no approach.
The other environments that I wanted to refer to is that if you look at Japan,
yes,
they've embraced heat-not-burn products from around 2015. They've seen drastic accelerated reduction of total tobacco use. So it's not been a gateway to increase people that use tobacco. Actually, it's going down. It's taken people away from combustible cigarettes to safer products. If you look at the UK, they've embraced e-cigarettes. They are seeing smoking rates come down. If you look at New Zealand, they've embraced e-cigarettes and the smoking rate is coming down. Their neighbor, Australia, has banned e-cigarettes and their smoking rates are ticking up, their tax revenues are coming down. Just to give you 3 different markets where they have embraced partially. You know, the UK is partial embracement of e-cigarettes because snus is still banned out there. Japan, e-cigarettes are still not allowed out there. Sweden is the only country where everything is allowed. They allow snus, they allow e-cigarettes, they allow heat-not-burn products, they allow nicotine pouches. And the females are now switching to nicotine pouches. They didn't like the tobacco pouches, but they seem to love the nicotine pouches. And evidence is there from the Global Health Report of the health benefits of the reduced risk products of the non-combustibles. Those are the comparisons that I just wanted to bring to the fore. Thank you.
I mean, that's really very, very helpful. I mean, you're talking to us about all these countries. You know, you started off by saying there seems to be no appropriate regulatory frameworks for risk-reduced products across the continent. You spoke of these countries like Japan, Australia, that are actually thriving with the harm reduction acceptance and putting it on board. We had some questions now, which really were around, if that is the case, and there are case studies out there, how come we have countries like, you know, we're advocating for THR, like Kondwani Chinele is asking here. We have for some time been talking about advocating for this. How is the progress like, you know, in countries like Malawi, across Africa? And how willing are African countries to adapt THR, and what challenges, you know, do you face in this adaptation? If I look at some of the other questions here, you have people, it's more or less around the same question, because if you could just try to tackle it, it's, you know, the governments are obviously invested in tobacco, especially tobacco growing countries. Some of them are invested in that. So once you start talking about, a harm reduction, people start worrying a little bit about, okay, is my livelihood going to be threatened? Catherine Manasseh is asking, naturally the tobacco industry, farmers and marketers are seeing a threat to their livelihood. Have you faced any backlash from that? We're talking about the Zambian government here. Daniel Chigundu from Zimbabwe is saying that tobacco is arguably one of the top paying agricultural commodities that has benefited many small farmers in Zimbabwe, and efforts to try and reduce smoking or efforts to bring in products that would be seen to be targeted at reducing smoking will be received with suspicion. So what can be done to change that, kind of mentality?
I think the key issue, particularly for us in Africa, we've got to understand that what is between our ears is not an ornament. And we've got to begin to use our brains so that we have agency. We stop being told. Now, unfortunately, on health, low middle income countries and most of Africa look at the WHO like it's the gospel according to WHO. And if you go back to what I've tried to illustrate, when it comes to harm reduction, the biggest accused, harm reduction with respect to tobacco, the number one accused is the WHO. They embrace harm reduction in other aspects. They've embraced harm reduction and promoted it in HIV and AIDS, use of condoms, safe sexual practices, antiretrovirals. They accept harm reduction in pandemics. We've just come from COVID. They allowed an experimental vaccine to be used on a harm reduction principle. Even though there was a lot we didn't know about the vaccines, we worked on what we knew about the vaccines. Now, that's where the problem comes from. And we need to address that so that people could ask WHO these questions. What I asked myself, there's a paper that came out that said if the countries in Europe had adopted using snus, they could have saved 350,000 lives per annum. But nobody is asking the WHO to account for that. Snus is still banned. We had countries like Belgium that were contemplating banning nicotine pouches. So there's an irrationality that you can't explain. Now, coming to the specific question that you asked about dependence on tobacco crops, it's because we're not thinking. Nearly 100% of the nicotine is produced from tobacco. There's very little synthetic nicotine out there. There are some products that you still use the tobacco leaf. Heat-not-burn products use tobacco. So if we were thinking, we could see where the market is moving to and be talking with the producers. Why is China the biggest source of nicotine? Because they are helping their tobacco farmers. Why are we not becoming the second largest producers of nicotine? Because we produce nicotine. Why are we negotiating along those lines? Why are we not coming with contract crop production for the companies that produce heat-not-burn products so that your tobacco would still be used for that purpose? Why are we not converting our cigarette plants in countries that have cigarette plants to snus plants? Because it goes back to part of what Clive spoke about, a question that was asked about affordability. Non-combustibles are a range of products, some of which are extremely affordable. Snus is affordable, snus is environment friendly. There are challenges with electronic products about electronic waste, etc., etc. You should make all products available, people should have choice and they should be affordable so they could be accessed. So you should look at differential tax regimes for all these products. You tax the most dangerous product at the level that you have. So everything that is less harmful than cigarettes should have a favorable tax regime relative to the taxation on cigarettes. But you see some countries where these products are taxed more than cigarettes, where the FCTC is no longer a framework convention for tobacco control. It is now being used to force consumers to combustibles.
Yeah, and I see, I see that, thanks for that, Kosi. I see that Monica Mayuni from Zambia is also, asking questions along the same lines to say, if she's from Zambia and she's asking here, talking to the Zambian government, I think a lot of people are thinking the same question. All governments are aware of this technology. All governments have the options and the decisions to make on the table as to what extent they embrace this, and the regulation will reflect that. And that is what we're saying we need to start looking at. And if I look down to Daniel's question, Daniel had asked the question around tobacco growing companies like Zim. And Clive has actually answered. If I could read out your response, Clive.
Tendai, can I just respond directly? I mean, I just elaborate very briefly on this discussion.
Clive,
yes.
Clive, I hope you'll then allude to your recommendations and advice around the COP, because this becomes an opportunity for the countries to go and advocate for their livelihoods at COP and say,
I agree with that. Look, the thing for the growing countries, okay, so let's take some Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, those countries where tobacco is very important to the economy, okay. The thing to understand is that they're selling into an international market. It's unrelated to what happens at home. Whether they can sell their product is immaterial. It's sold, ultimately ends up in cigarettes and tobacco products and potentially vaping products that are sold over the entire world. Now, it's likely that the demand will go down over time, but these countries are not marginal producers. They are not at the expensive end of production. So the key strategy for the growing countries is, well, threefold, I would say. First of all, improve productivity. Okay, so if you look at tobacco yields, they range from around 300 kilograms to 4,000 kilograms per hectare. Okay, and in terms of quality, from around $1 to $6 per kilogram. Now, within that space, there is enormous scope for productivity gains. But to do that, you have to get capital investment in. You have to get irrigation, you have to get better curing barns, you need to be less reliant on wood and so on. Okay, so that's about creating the climate of investment that works for the tobacco growing businesses. If they get their productivity up, the land take will go down and they can diversify, which is the second major strategy for them, so that they can start growing other things and be less reliant on tobacco overall. And then thirdly, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to link the health of the public and public health policies to growing policies in the country. It makes absolutely no difference, okay? You may as well bring in tobacco harm reduction, you may as well have as much smoking cessation as you can, because if you don't, you'll be paying at the back end of that for healthcare costs, economic losses in the workforce and so on. So that's the way to think about it from the perspective of a growing country. Think about exploiting the economic opportunity. It makes no difference to public health. Go for productivity gains, go for diversity, but for goodness sake, don't lose sight of the public health agenda.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. Clive has also put in an article on tobacco growing, which I think you should all, take on there, which is quite important as well. To finish up that question.
Tendai, if I just say about that, I mean, is absolutely ludicrous. This is where Josie is absolutely right. WHO makes these incredibly contentious statements about, tobacco growing being an alternative to food and feeding your population.
Yeah.
I've done an analysis that shows that that's completely wrong. That's complete rubbish. Tobacco farmers use the money they earn from tobacco to buy food in international markets, just in the same way the rest of us go to work. We earn a salary, and we use that to buy food in the shops. It's not a different way of doing things. And while there's a demand for tobacco, they're not taking food off anybody's table at all. Yeah. So I've tried to just put a corrective into this, but it is an interesting insight into how WHO thinks about what is actually a core economic activity for some countries in Africa, casually, lazily, and disdainfully.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's interesting. I think also we have an interesting one, which is talking around. Sorry, I'm just going down to. I think I've lost the one I was looking at. I've lost it. I'll come back to it. So somebody was talking here about there being some countries where there is good legislation. For example, Botswana. Sorry, can somebody help me? I've lost the particular question. All right, maybe we'll come back to that one. I don't know where I've lost it. We'll come back to that one. Let's move on to the youth. It was raised before, after Clive spoke, to do with legislation. Clive mentioned something as he was talking. He mentioned something to do with flavors and things like that. And there has been a lot of talk in different media about don't these flavors and yummy things and, interesting, colorful looking vapes and that attract the youth. And Fatima's question is, do we have to, we have to look carefully about who is using these products and why. Data shows that the most frequent adolescent users of the products would otherwise be smoking, and therefore youth vaping can also be positive for public health. But also because the risks are much lower, we should need to get public health consequences in proportion. We do not generally worry about caffeine uptake or even modest alcohol use, but I hope we can discuss this a little bit further. Do you have any input for that, Clive?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated subject, and it's very emotive. And the question is what you think young people would be doing anyway. If you think these vaping products, if they simply didn't exist and were taken off the, sorry about the phone in the background, and were taken completely off the market, would the kids just be doing more homework or practicing the piano or doing gainful economic activity? No, they would probably be doing something else. And in many cases, what they would be doing is smoking. So we have to keep in mind the counterfactual. The evidence we have where vaping has become prevalent and where there's a lot of youth uptake shows that the most frequent and intense users are the kind of kids who would otherwise be smoking. And in effect, vaping has diverted them away from smoking and reduced the total harm and total risk, and therefore is health beneficial. Now, not everybody likes that argument, but it is a fact about how this actually works. Secondly, I think you have to remember that flavors themselves can't be the reason why. I mean, back in the past, we had very high levels of youth smoking in say the UK. It'd be like 35%, something like that, similar in the United States, when the only products that were available were cigarettes. And that's because kids are very, very strongly motivated to do what adults do. I mean, that's the nature of adolescence, is to experiment with these products and see if they like them. So you can't pin it all on flavors. The kids will do this if they think that that's a sort of rite of passage. And that's a much more sensible kind of sociological way of looking at it. Then I think the next stage of the argument is, well, these products are much less harmful than smoking. So, you know, while we might see kids that are taking up these products and you know, who may not have taken them up in the past, we need to be less worried about that and think of them more like, I mean, I'm not saying it's the same as, but more like caffeine and less like smoking. And therefore, there's less reason to be concerned about it. And then the final part of the argument is that there are kids, there are adults who get something from nicotine. And I showed you a couple of examples from that. And I'm sorry, it was necessarily, we had to skate through that. But for some people, nicotine is enjoyable. For some people, it helps them deal with stress and anxiety. For some people, it helps, has a therapeutic effect on mental health problems such as schizophrenia and attention deficit disorder. It's probably therapeutic against Parkinson's disease, maybe Alzheimer's. So there are reasons to use nicotine, and as soon as you work away, you get rid of the assumption that the only demand is the demand that's being created by, you know, big tobacco or vaping companies, and realize there's an actual demand for the product because of what people get from it, just as there's a demand for caffeine and a demand for alcohol. Even if we think they're unhealthy, there's also a demand for unhealthy food. Then the question becomes, how do we meet that demand in the safest way possible? And those 4 categories of products are 1 to 2 orders of magnitude safer than smoking. 4 categories being vaping, heated tobacco products, oral nicotine, and smokeless tobacco products. And that's the public health approach to this. Assume there's a demand for nicotine that will be met somehow, and then find the safest ways of meeting it. And that's how I think about the youth issue. And don't assume that all kids would just be doing nothing if it wasn't for the presence of these products. They'd either be smoking, they'd be taking cannabis, they'd be drinking heavily, they'd be doing other risky things.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I think, you know, following on from that, we've had quite a lot of questions, particular questions to do with vaping. Clive has some answers in there, some articles. Please refer to those. Basically says that there's no evidence that vaping is a material contributor to cancers. He has put some resources in there that you can look at. I think, you know, some people have asked about the different emissions and that, and as I stated earlier, from both Kosi and Clive, vapes come in different shapes and sizes from different manufacturers, and it's around standards. There's no standard order for all of them, and there are many studies that are available online that you can look at that give you particular information about vapes and the different risk factors. Of course, Clive is sharing his presentation with us today, and he had some statistics there on risk factors of smokeless products as well. So just in ending off, I would like to go to the question that came here, the comment that came from Mauzu Alaze. I hope I've said that correctly. Mauzu Alaze. She spoke of this issue of misinformation and disinformation surrounding THR and smokeless products, and that, you know, key stakeholders, you know, sometimes you know, it is rife. They're at, you know, they fall down at the hands of misinformation and disinformation. And, you know, that is something that needs to be addressed. She also asks the question, which I'm going to ask both of you to end off with, as we just have a few minutes left, is that how best can African countries have regulatory frameworks that are science and evidence-based? At the moment, there seems to be no coordination amongst nations in the continent as far as tobacco control is concerned. Can I just ask you each to just give a 2-minute end note on that one?
Yeah.
Clive? do you want to start? Or
Okay.
Kosi?
So, so I think on what should be done, the basic answer is risk proportionate regulation. Okay, in which you put the consumer interest first, and you try and arrange the regulatory, the tax, and the communications environment so that it encourages people to follow a pathway from high risk to low risk products. Okay. So that would be high taxes on cigarettes, low or no taxes on vaping products. Bold warnings on cigarettes, but information communications about relative risk on e-cigarettes. You would, so you would want to ban the advertising of cigarettes, advertising, promotion, and sponsorship associated with cigarettes. But maybe you'd want to put controls on themes so that it didn't imply it was useful or so on. So that's the way to go about it. When I send you my presentation, I'll add a couple of slides on risk proportionate regulation, just so there's a bit more in there. But that, I think, is the right way to do it. At the moment, we have either we see three or four strategies from the anti-harm reduction people. The first is to press for prohibition, and the Bloomberg funded groups are pressing for that all over Africa and all over LMICs. Secondly, to regulate as if it's equivalent to cigarettes, which is ridiculous given the risks are 1, 2, maybe 3 orders of magnitude different. And then thirdly, to try and force them into a pharmaceutical category, which require a prescription from a doctor, which is just a ridiculous misunderstanding of what these products are. They're not medicines, they're consumer alternatives to cigarettes. And then finally, and somebody mentioned it, is misinformation, trying to make these products feel more risky than they are. And I'm afraid to say that some in the tobacco control community and even some governments and health agencies have become the new merchants of doubt. That's what we used to say about the tobacco industry when they were trying to stop people, quitting smoking. They just created doubt. Now, what's happening now is the tobacco control people are the merchants of doubt, and that's immensely harmful, unethical, and unacceptable. And it's really up to journalists to challenge that head on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Clive. I'll have your
Pleasure.
Closing comments, Kosi?
I think for Africa, what you have to do to sort Africa's problem is to deal with the WHO, because that's where they get their marching orders from. Fix the lies from the WHO, deal with the WHO. Because remember, in most of our countries, the WHO is a key player in delivery of services. It's a key, a fair amount of some of the services to our people comes from donor funding, and you get that if the WHO gives you approval. So there's a lot of dependence on the WHO. So it's going to be difficult to get the ministers of health or African countries to bite the hand that feeds them. Yeah. So it's going to be up to us, journalists, activists, civil society, to call the WHO to account. That's the only way you're going to get proper, coherent policies in Africa. Mm-hmm. And the second underlying issue around that is to make people understand prohibition doesn't work. Prohibition needs to criminalization, it leads to an underground business. It does not get rid of the business. It just makes it underground. Then you can't protect the public because you can't regulate it. And you are losing revenue out of it, and you are endangering the public. So whatever happens, whatever the policies are, you go to engage all parties. Prohibition is not an option. And that, deal with the WHO, and you'll create proper frameworks throughout Africa.
Thank you so much, Kosi, for that. And thank you, Clive. Thank you for this amazing informative session on science and harm reduction. This Ask Me session, we've had so many questions and so many really insightful and deep and useful answers. Please, for the delegates, the members of the media who are here online, please start to write stories about this session, about what is in this session, the important things that we need to share with all of the African citizenry. Start writing stories. And also, Clive has said that he's happy to continue to answer any questions or have any discussions with anybody, or if you'd like to do an interview, you can contact Clive. Is it Clive? Is it at mail or Gmail?
Oh, Gmail. Did I put up the wrong address?
Yes, I think.
Oh my goodness. So sorry. Technical
Okay.
error.
So it's Clive Bates. I think he's going to type it in again there.
Clive D. Bates. Don't forget the D as well.
Clive D. Bates at gmail.com.
I can't believe I typed in the wrong email.
Yeah, the stories that
So
you
sorry
do-
about that. So I've tried to answer as many questions as I could in the chat, but if I didn't get to your question or you didn't think I answered it properly, I mean, do come back to me. I'm very open to discussions with this. I mean, it matters a great deal, particularly in Africa, what people think about this issue. So I'm happy to elaborate on any points and stay in touch with people, particularly as we approach the Framework Convention meeting in November. I've sent you my article earlier in the chat about how delegates should prepare for that. Josie, the situation in South Africa is very live at the moment, and I think the danger with that is that it might set a benchmark for the whole continent and possibly the whole world if we're not careful. So we need to pay careful attention to that. There's some terrible things really foisted into the argument by American foundations and activist groups. You need to be very well aware of the role that they're playing in Africa. It's very aggressive.
Yeah, and I think
anyway, I'm happy to follow up with anybody on anything.
Thank you, Clive. I think this is at the heart of this. It's something that the media, you are experiencing on a daily basis, how to counter misinformation and disinformation. But in any case, thank you so much, Kosi, Clive. Thank you so much to all the delegates
just a question
for attending. Sorry, yes.
Is a recording available of this session?
Yeah, yes, the recording will be available. We've been recording. The recording will be available.
Okay, please send it to me.
Okay, and I just want to thank you all for your time, and again, please write stories and have a great day further.
Thank you.
Goodbye, folks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye to everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Bye. Be safe out there.